My wife humiliated me in front of everyone, loudly declaring that nothing would happen between us. So, in a fit of heartbreak, I packed my bags, cancelled our Paris anniversary trip, and moved to the guest room. Now, I'm considering separation and planning a solo trip to California. Her actions left me with no choice. My wife and I have been together for almost 20 years, and our bedroom life has been on a slow but gradual decline for the last 15 years. We sat down and talked a few months ago, where we hashed out the details of trying to rekindle the spark we once had. One of the main things we both agreed upon was the need for date nights as well as other things. Things seemed to improve, albeit only marginally. Again, I'm the one initiating things 90% of the time, but I get shot down. The usual excuses followed: too tired, not in the mood, the child is awake, he's 18 years old, not feeling very well, and my personal favorite, it's the weekend, and you have to be up for work early anyhow. We persisted with the date nights. Out of 9 that I organized over the last 2 months, my wife canceled 7 of them, often without notice. Some were even planned weeks when she'd breathe in after her work shift and announce she was going out with her friends. When I mentioned the date night we had planned, she claimed she'd simply forgotten, despite it being marked on the calendar on the fridge. Again, her idea. So on to this weekend. I spent the last 2 weeks setting up a date night. Picture this, a whole weekend away. A suite at a 5-star hotel, dinner at a fancy Michelin star restaurant, tickets to the theater, and even shopping for some fancy clothes. I picked her up after work. I packed some casual clothes for us both, toiletries, etc. I told her I had a surprise plan for her, and she immediately started protesting, saying she had things to do. I told her everything had been taken care of and she didn't have to worry. She raised the issue of clothing, but I informed her that I had it covered. She seemed to calm down at this point, and off we set, although the atmosphere in the car was cold, to say the least. A few hours later, we arrived at the hotel and checked in. She seemed to cheer up when she saw the suite we had. On Saturday, we headed out shopping ahead of our planned evening. Several hours later, we returned to the hotel to get ready for dinner. After a while, she emerged from the bathroom. I can't put into words how amazing she looked. Wearing a dark blue evening gown, matching lingerie, 4-inch heels, jewelry, and with her hair and makeup done perfectly. Let's just say my jaw was on the floor when she saw me staring. She smiled at me and gave me a twirl. She looked as stunning as the day we tied the knot. So the dinner went as well as it could, although there was very little conversation between us. We hailed a taxi and headed out to the theater. At least I got a thanks for this part. I'd also arranged for a pair of mutual friends to join us at the theater, so we took our seats and enjoyed the show. Just as the intermission started, I reached over and placed my hand over hers to ask if she liked the show so far. To my surprise, she snatched her hand away from mine as if she'd just been bitten by a poisonous snake. She looked me square in the eyes and proceeded to tell me that whatever I was thinking was going to happen tonight when we got back to the hotel, I could forget it. Her words almost dripped with disdain and venom, and she was loud enough for several people around us to hear. Our friends didn't know where to look or what to say. My wife told me to move because she needed to use the bathroom. At this point, something inside me just snapped, and I got up. I apologized to our friends, informed them I was leaving, and hoped they enjoyed the rest of the show. I received a text message from my friends just as I got back to our hotel room, informing me they had told my wife that I'd left and that she just shrugged her shoulders. Still seething with mounting anger, I decided I was heading home, so I packed my clothes, caught a taxi to the nearest train station, and managed to get the last train home. This morning, I decided to relocate to the guest room. I noticed I needed some new bedroom furniture, so I headed down to IKEA. I've given up building flat packs for the day. My wife, however, has asked what the new furniture is for, but I think she realized when she noticed my clothes and other personal items weren't in the master bedroom. She didn't say anything to me until about an hour ago when she asked me why I was being so childish. I politely explained the previous cancelled date nights in favor of her friends, and she, in my opinion, completely unnecessarily had an outburst at me. During the intermission at the theater, she just shrugged her shoulders again and asked if intimacy was all I was interested in. I brought up the issue of her attitude when I picked her up from work Friday afternoon with the intent of surprising her. She told me to deal with it. My wife's best friend contacted me and asked what had gone on. My wife had told her only part of what happened, so I filled her in on all the gory details. To say she was shocked was an understatement. She proceeded to ask me what I planned to do considering I was planning a trip to Paris for our anniversary later in the year. I stated that the trip wasn't going ahead because of her actions at the theater. My darling wife still hasn't apologized for her outburst. She still claims that she may have overreacted slightly, to use her exact words. Beth promptly called my wife and put her on speakerphone. Beth then proceeded to tear her a new one. To add insult to injury, she spilled the beans about the proposed trip to Paris for our anniversary. My wife proceeded to gush, saying that she knew I'd get over it as I couldn't say no to her. Her happy mood disappeared when Beth informed her that I'd cancelled minutes ago. I've also spoken to a solicitor concerning a separation and eventual divorce. I recently renewed my passport, and when it arrived, my wife's first reaction was to ask if the trip to Paris was back on. I replied, or rather snapped back at her, that no, it wasn't back on and the possibility of it ever being planned again was virtually zero. She then proceeded to ask if that was the case, why I bothered to renewing my passport. I replied by stating that I have almost 2 months of holiday time saved up from last year and this year, so I'm planning on flying out to California to see an old friend. Her jaw dropped to the floor. She appeared to be trying to say something, but nothing was coming out. Yesterday morning, when I got in from work, I found her sitting at the kitchen table along with Beth. My wife appeared to have been crying by the look of her eyes and face. I then reached into my bag, pulled out 2 A4 S&P, lace, and placed them on the table in front of her. I then explained the contents of the envelopes. The first one contained a rough draft of a separation agreement drawn up by my lawyer, which would likely end in us getting divorced. Upon hearing my words, she started bawling her eyes out again. Her friend calmed her down and asked her what she thought I'd do, as she mentioned that during our conversation, Beth had picked up on my cold demeanor and tone. Beth also suggested that my wife had pushed me too far when she humiliated me in front of our friends after I went to the trouble of organizing everything, which it turns out by my wife's admission, was something she'd wished I'd surprised her with. After my wife calmed down, I proceeded to explain that the second envelope contained a list of marriage counselors and instructions for her to choose one. She was then given the ultimatum to choose one of the envelopes. I would be leaving Sunday morning to catch my first flight to the US, and she had until the time I returned to make the decision. I refused to be spoken to and treated like I was that night, adding the fact that she didn't see, and I'm still not sure she does, that her reaction was uncalled for and way over the top.
Before she could respond, I bothered no uncertain terms that if she started screaming at me, the second option would be immediately removed from the equation.
I also reiterated that if I found out she was seeing someone else while I was away, option 1 would be selected by default. Update 2, I'm finally back home. I received messages, voicemails, emails, and missed calls, mostly from my wife and a few from friends and family. It turns out the friends we were with that fateful weekend had informed my parents of what went on, along with a few other mutual friends who had inquired about my well-being since he'd been pretty much radio silent since I left for my trip. The messages from my wife started with the usual empty platitudes, insincere apologies, etc. I assumed that when I didn't give her the satisfaction of responding, the messages became more menacing and darker, almost to the point of threatening. I rang her and told her that I landed back in the UK and I'd be home after I made a quick stop off at my mother's house. She seemed overly affectionate and sweet on the phone and almost had me wondering if it was the same person I left. When I got home, my wife practically rugby tackled me the second I was through the door again, showering me with affection as if nothing had happened at all. She made small talk, asking if I'd enjoyed my trip, where I'd been, and what I'd seen. I waved her off my lap, sat her down on the sofa next to me, and asked her bluntly if she'd decided on the 2 envelopes I presented to her before I left. She simply offed at me and asked if I was serious because she assumed I was just being childish and throwing a tantrum. I informed her that I was deadly serious about it, and if she'd given it any thought, she just smirked at me and told me to stop being stupid and get over it. My reply was that she'd given me her answer and thanked her for letting me know where I stood, at which point I rang the solicitor who drew up the 2 sets of papers. Although I hated ringing her on a Friday afternoon while she was likely with family, she asked me what choice my wife had made. I informed her that I didn't want to discuss it over the phone and could make an appointment next week to discuss it in person and go over my options. As I wrote down the appointment time, I caught my wife staring daggers at me and I was so red in the face that I thought she might be on the verge of either having a stroke, a heart attack, or both. After I finished the call, I turned to face her, and before she had time to say anything, I told her she'd made her choice and that I was serious about it. I heard her on the phone sobbing to her best friend about the situation, asking for help on how she could fix it. I couldn't hear the other half of the conversation, but from the sobs my wife was making, I could only assume that the advice wasn't what she wanted to hear. Over the next few days, things at home remained tense. My wife's attempts to reconcile were intense but insincere, and it was clear to me that her desperation wasn't genuine regret but a reaction to the potential loss of our marriage. She started by making grand gestures, bringing me breakfast in bed, writing heartfelt notes, and trying to rekindle the intimacy she had so long neglected. However, her actions felt hollow. It was clear she was trying to make up for her previous actions rather than genuinely changing her behavior. Meanwhile, I kept my distance, focusing on my emotional well-being and planning my next steps. I met with the lawyer to discuss the separation agreement and the possibility of divorce. It was a difficult process, but necessary to ensure my future was secure and to gain clarity on how to proceed. A week later, I received a call from my wife's best friend, Beth. She informed me that my wife had been visiting a marriage counselor, as I had requested, though it was clear she was only doing so under duress. Beth was genuinely concerned for both of us and offered her support, but she couldn't provide much hope that my wife's attitude had changed. When I confronted my wife about her progress with the counselor, she admitted that she was going through the motions but wasn't fully committed. Her attitude remained dismissive, and she continued to make excuses. It was clear that the root of the problem wasn't just about date nights or failed attempts at romance, it was about respect, communication, and a fundamental disconnect. In the end, I realized that the foundation of our marriage had eroded beyond repair. Despite my efforts and the concessions I made, the lack of sincere change on her part meant that continuing the relationship was no longer viable. I informed her of my decision to proceed with the separation. The conversation was painful, with tears and heated arguments, but I remained firm in my resolve. My priority was to ensure a fair process and to focus on my healing. I'm now in the process of moving forward with the divorce, seeking counseling for myself, and making plans for a future that, while uncertain, holds the promise of a fresh start. The road ahead will be challenging, but it's one I'm prepared to face with the hope of finding peace and happiness in the end.